Hi, this is Ryan with Generational Talk. So the next video has another batch of Xers having a conversation about their childhood experience. We talk about the way they were parented, the type of movies they liked, cartoons, music, whether or not John Hughes films really represent the generation. Join the conversation. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell if you want more videos just like this.
I'm Amy. I was born in 1965.
My name is Justin. I was born in 1979.
Well, my name's Michael. I was born in 71.
Name's Sean Love, 1968 cohort, core Xer, who I said in our Facebook messaging before, feels like he grew up in a John Hughes film.
So Tommy, 1988, I guess that would put me pretty much right in the middle for the Pew Research years for a millennial.
My name is Sherry, and I was born 1970. Can't wait to talk about the John Hughes films.
I'm Shana Swain. I am from Charleston, South Carolina. I'm born May 31st, 27 days in 1979.
Obie is short for O'Brien. That's the government name. I changed it back April 2nd, 2014 to Maarifa. It means knowledge in Swahili. I just wanted to do something different. I wanted to identify in a different way. First, let me say, Ryan, I appreciate the invite, appreciate the platform. Look at everyone's looking good, looking healthy despite the circumstances and the pandemic or not pandemic, whatever the government's calling it.
Pandemic.
I was born in, what year was I born? June 2nd, 1978. When I looked up the Generation X, it said I was a Generation X person, and that the millennials came after that. And then I think my son fits into the Generation Z mix. So I'm not sure how that all plays out. I'm looking forward to the dialogue and see how that goes. Shout out to Shanna Banana. We grew up together in Charleston, South Carolina. Shout out. My family's from Jamaica. We came to the United States. So that's the perspective I'm going to bring. Let's work.
My name is Melody. My birthday is July 28th, 1977. So I'm a Star Wars baby. I identify as a Star Wars baby because we came out in the same year. And definitely an Xer, and I don't like being called anything else.
This panel is different from the last one because I feel like we favored more Jonesers. And the last one, Gen Jones, that's the transition, the cusp between boomers and X, and then also the first wave of Generation X. Most of those guys were born in the 60s. You guys favored the 70s, 1968 for Sean, right? Or 69?
68,
so,
yeah.
And from that conversation alone, and Sherry and Amy could back me up, I already saw the difference between the waves. My first impression of Generation X came from my older sibling, my older brother, who was born in 1979, from the real world, from everything I saw on MTV, from the cool people at the coffee shops, Living Single, Martin. Those are my first, all the movies I couldn't watch, House Party, Friday, all the movies that my parents told me I couldn't watch as a kid, those movies featured Xers. So you guys are just too cool for me. And
I have to jump in here and say there was never any movie I wasn't allowed to watch.
That's how we're starting this. Like, I'm noticing that trend.
There was one for me. My sister, I was obsessed with Christian Slater. And he was everything after I saw Gleaming the Cube. And my sister, I wanted to see Heathers so bad. Like I saw a preview for it on Cinemax. And she was like, you are never, ever, 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 ever going to see that movie. Never, never. And it became my favorite movie in the whole world. And I know it by heart.
And speaking of Cinemax, you Xers taught me how to watch Cinemax and other channels that were scrambled after certain hours.
That's true.
So Ryan, you don't consider yourself part of the Generation X part? You're more like in the middle?
I'm just calling myself the middle. So in 1991, Doug Copeland released Generation X, Tales of an Accelerated Culture. A Boston Globe quote from Copeland says, "I just want to show society what people born after 1960 think about things. We're sick of stupid labels. We're sick of being marginalized and lousy jobs. We're tired of hearing about ourselves from others." I bet, like, when I think of the 90s, some of the early labels were Slacker, Strauss and Howe. I thought personally, in their 13th generation book, they had a very abusive description of Xers. I mean, we'll get to that story. But basically, let's start out. How do you guys define your generation?
Well, I'd say, for me, I didn't have any conception of it being a part of anything until I read 13th Gen sometime around 94 or 95. In college, I had a vague sense that the throwback hippies ahead of us had different values, but it wasn't until I read that and started thinking, are these characteristics that define myself and people I know, that I even had any idea that we might be a thing. I never felt like I belonged to any group.
Melody?
I think that's one thing that defines Gen X is that we were very, very separated into groups. They were very, very cliquey. There was the goths, the preps, it just like Breakfast Club. Everybody fit into a group, and you were either defined by what you looked like or the music you listened to. Later in the 90s defined you. So I think we were the last generation that wasn't all mashed up. I think we bridged the mashup. We went from being separated to being together. And so like generations that came after that, they don't fit into a clique. Their cliques are made up of all sorts of people in their cliques. Mm-hmm. It was more about friendship than it was about, coming together because you liked something.
I would say that's true. That definitely speaks for my class, those who were born in 81. The clique started to dissolve, and it was more about like, let's be friends with everybody. And that's my situation. I don't want to generalize for people in other regions. I think there's definitely a regional aspect to this.
Mm-hmm. I had a friend who was a few years younger. He was a class of 2000, and I remember he was in a punk band and he was a jock. And this blew my mind, because I thought, you're supposed to hate yourself then,
right?
Are against the jocks, but he was a star athlete and in a punk rock band, and he just seemed so like well aligned or well adjusted inside of himself. He didn't seem to have any sort of antipathy towards anybody, and that was kind of a bit of an awakening. And then I wondered, like, what's wrong with us? Why are we like this? Who taught us to be like this? Couldn't explain why it was like that. I remember noticing that at the time.
I think we were the last generation that
you're going where I'm going.
That kind of, needed that comfort, of being around people like you. And that's a throwback to 50s, 60s of people, gathering in groups of just people like themselves, and then it started to break apart after that.
Sherry, did you notice any of the shift?
Yeah, as I shared with you, Ryan, I think that there's a bit of Maslow's hierarchy here. And I think one of the reasons why Xers became cliquey, which definitely has negative connotations, it was actually rooted in just looking for a place to belong. Those very, very early needs that all humans have to belong to a family unit, to know where they fit, to have that security, those are usually met in the family unit. And in the 70s, the family unit kind of blew up. And so we sort of created our own as we got into adulthood. As teenagers, we were clumsy about it. There were cliques. It was based on things that don't really matter. But then as we moved into our 20s, I think it became a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more honestly relational. But yeah, definitely our peer group, our friendships were very, very important.
I know, Shana, you're friends with everybody. But did you notice the tribal clique aspect in your experience?
I was thinking about those same things. I swear our telepathy is real strong. But I was thinking about those concepts as y'all were talking about the cliques. And I do believe the cliques are true. And I was actually going to chime in as soon as Sherry did, and talking about as far as how mothers were at work during our time growing up. Divorces started to become a thing. So the family unit had been disseminated at that point. So cliques in high school, even in elementary school, were definitely present. Mm-hmm. And as a person who usually does not know a stranger, it was weird for me, because as you were speaking of that, I said, God, I used to be like the orchestra nerd playing the violin, but I also wore Birkenstocks and smoked occasional pot. Like I was in every little group that they had at South Carolina, and in high school, except maybe the athletes. I was not an athletic person, so I didn't get to do that. But I was friends with them. So yeah, the cliques were real deep and growing up in where we're from.
You mentioned childhood. Before I pivot to that, does anyone else want to add to the high school experience with cliques?
I don't think they were always mean-spirited.
Okay.
I think the cliques existed rooted, I mean, I'll speak for my high school, you know, it was rooted in activities, you know, the kind of things you enjoyed, maybe the kinds of music you liked. There were certainly people who were, they were just unkind, you know, or they were perhaps a little bit more hostile than others, but I don't know that the cliques overall were mean-spirited. I don't remember feeling like any one person was untouchable. You just kind of glommed together, you know, based on what you liked and what you could do. The actual, whether or not a person was nice or not, that transcended. That was sort of everywhere, and that just had more to do with human personality, I think, than a given clique.
Question for the parents out there, and I know that several of you do have kids who are school age or older, some in college. Do you feel that your children had the same type of cliques that you described, or did it change with your kids?
My kids, when we watch old movies, they can't kind of understand how cliquey things are, or even that kids were as mean to each other as I think they were when we were all young, which of course means I would have been a part of it, but you know, it really strikes me how willing the kids are to be friends with all sorts of people. It really comes down to whether or not they have chemistry with somebody more than what kind of group that person is in. There still are groups, but it's not exclusionary. It's not like the metal kids can't talk to the alternative indie kids, you know?
I have young children. One is school age, one will be school age in 2 months. But I would say my observation with Zuri, who'll be in 3rd grade, is already that of every single person their age is in one big group. They don't have social media, but they're on YouTube, whatever their influences are, have grouped all of these kids into liking the same things, wanting the same things, eating the same things. There is nothing different. And I try to encourage individuality with my kids, but even those great powers of technology beat me at it a lot. And I've noticed that individuality is almost getting squashed, and she's only 8.
I agree with you on that. It's been weird for me because I always, you know, when we were growing up, I thought whatever was popular or mainstream was automatically uncool. It's like the last thing on earth you wanted to buy was the album that was being marketed to you. But for them, they just like wholeheartedly embrace it and adopt it, and there's no questions about it. And I've seen that with my eldest all the way to, well, I mean, the youngest, she's only 8, but I feel like I really look at them and I feel like it's like, you know, 1950s again.
Oh, wow.
Why are you listening to that? Like everyone, you know, inside, I guess, is still kind of skeptical or something. Like, why would you do that? You know, likes it, so you obviously should do something else, you know.
One thing I noticed is in my growing up, the cliques, there were some people in the upper echelon sort of that were untouchable, but for the most part, you know, it was like others were talking about, they were approachable, but definitely defined, distinct cliques. When I see my son today, 18, and my daughter, 14, they have groups, but they seem to be networked, where a person can be in several different orbits at the same time. So there are these distinct groups, but the groups themselves are their own entity, not the people in them. And so people can have more than one identity and they're kind of networked together, which made me think that there is sort of this one big networked group sort of that we didn't have. And I've always been curious about the school shooter phenomenon. when I was growing up, the outcasts could have their own little group. You know, now the outcasts. I mean, I did not grow up as a millennial, so I can't say this for certain. But from observation, the outcasts seem to be isolated on the fringes, right, which makes it seems to maybe play into this school shooter phenomenon that we didn't, for the most part, didn't have. We had in urban areas, especially in the 90s, but also beginning in the 80s, there was this this phenomenon untalked about guns in schools and so forth, but it wasn't a big media thing. But now this whole thing where people get 18 people, whatever, getting shot in schools, that was not going on in our time.
I remember the episode of My So-Called Life where they had to, where everybody thought Ricky brought a gun to school, and then they came into school one day and they had the metal detectors, and it was such a huge deal. Like the whole like tone of the show completely changed. And I think that was the first time, and also like 21 Jump Street and Lean on Me, you know, I mean, schools were still pretty scary back then, but it wasn't one dude. It was like tons of people being scary, you know?
I was just going to say a couple of things that I agree with Shannon when she was talking about, no. I think it was either Sherry or Amy. Amy was talking about, it was based on interest, like our cliques. I think it was you, Sherry. You're talking about interest. It wasn't necessarily, the cliques weren't necessarily abusive. But then I thought some more. And I would say that there is a string of abuse that went into some of these cliques. And that if you weren't a part of that, you were kind of ostracized. And, you know, you had your other clique to fall into. I think, Michael, you were talking about, no, it was either Michael or Sean, and people who were outcasts had places to go. You still had your place you could fit into, and that now there was no place for it, and people just kind of by themselves and isolated. And I would say that my son, who's now a freshman at UNC Greensboro, they did cross each other's groups. It still was interest-based. He was definitely in sports a lot. So he was with that group. He was in theater also. So with that group, and they all kind of crossed over, and there was really no big deal that I could tell. I think he'd been able to speak to it better than me. But I do think there was a lot of abuse going on behind the scenes if you weren't part of a certain clique.
Okay.
And as far as the school shootings, funny, not funny, the first time I ever saw school shootings was Pearl Jam. And Pearl Jam, it didn't click at first either, because Pearl Jam does Jeremy. I'm like, looking back on it, I'm like, why would Pearl Jam do a whole video on it when I don't recall any school shootings prior to 1996? When did 10 come out? Pearl Jam 10 album. Was that, what was that? That was
93, 94?
91, I think.
91. So I'm wondering what caused them to make that song, Eddie Vedder, to create that song. And I didn't see a school shooting that was major until Columbine. And what was that, 97, 98?
99.
99, okay, 99. So
my class.
Yeah.
Baby boomers are depicted as the generation that grew up during a idealized, safe period post-war. You know, we could go into debate on if that was true, depending upon race or gender or region. But, you know, big picture wise, it seems like it was a pretty good life until they, I guess, as a collective, pushed against that life. How do you feel that the Xer childhood pushed against a previous way of raising kids?
Oh yeah. Latchkey kids.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I agree.
What does a latchkey kid mean to you?
It's basically when both parents went to work. You know, the mothers started going to work and the dads were going to work, and the kid had to wear a key around their neck because they basically took care of themselves. They went home and no one was there until like 6 or 7 o'clock at night. And that was the way I grew up. My dad was an air traffic controller, and he was part of the strike in the early 80s. And then my mom was a nurse. So I was actually thinking about it last night. I was like, from the time I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, I was always alone because my sister's 7 years older than me. She's like a real Gen Xer. And, but she hated me. She thought I was a brat, a little kid. She didn't want anything to do with me. She was real smart. She was into activities. So she was never home either. I was always alone and really, really young too.
You know, I think Strauss and Howe hit it on the head for me when they said it was like, we came in after the party was over, and the beach was, where was that? The beach was strewn with cans.
Yeah.
That was so right. And I think it felt like the adult world, even really well-meaning adults, they were just so self-absorbed. The boomers and silent of our childhood were so self-absorbed that we were lost in the shuffle. Again, even the most well-meaning people. The divorce revolution has, in essence, continued. So millennials and Zoomers are still putting up with, I mean, I'm divorced and my kids have to put up with that. But there seems to be things in place now. Remember the kids, you know, and resources and stuff that one was saying or doing or having when we were there.
Sure.
They saw how we were turning out and got scared.
Yeah.
The answer, I was thinking, Ryan, and Sean just touched on this when you said was the way that we were raised a pushback. I don't think it wasn't an intentional pushback. I think that adults in the 70s were still living their lives as a pushback. It's like, well, when my mom was in her not me speaking, but like boomers would say, when my mom was in her 30s, she was doing this, but now I'm in my 30s and I'm going to do this instead, without realizing that there were ramifications that fell onto an entire generation of kids. And this idea that, kids can handle anything, or you could throw anything at a child and they'll know how to navigate it. That was really very much, I remember an uncle saying that actually quite frequently. Oh, kids can handle anything. And we've learned not so much. Actually, they can't.
Right.
That's why I think we ended up relatively coarse compared to when I see my son's friends and people older than us. We seem to be, I mean, a little more jaded, generally a little more coarse, a little more calloused, yet can also be more empathetic about certain things that other generations can't be because of that.
I don't know. We were taught to be tough. We had to toughen ourselves. We couldn't be soft, because we would get tore up.
And I thought we were left, and this was my thought, and it sounds like it's being echoed. We were kind of left to ourselves. I mean, you just figure it out on your own.
Which means you probably make connections that are not correct.
Right. Right. And then what's driving your thought process? What's your new philosophy? If parents aren't actually guiding you step by step in certain things, where are you getting your myths, beliefs, truths from? And I think that's where pop culture really, television. When we get to that part, I can't wait. I can't.
Yeah.
For those of you who are parents, or even if you're not yet, you talk about the Latchkey Kid, the 7-8-year-old kid who's taking care of themselves and their younger siblings alone. As parents, what do you feel? When did you feel comfortable leaving your children alone? I mean, what's the appropriate age?
I still don't feel comfortable.
12, 13, 14, 15.
Yeah, 18.
If I had my druthers, I'd be putting a chip in my 18-year-old to this day.
Right?
I'm not going to lie. I'm biased because I have a son. So if I had a daughter, it would be different. But my son, Daniel, I was comfortable leaving him by himself once he showed age appropriation. Like, he was comfortable. He was proven in his actions, responsible, and that he could self-govern himself. Like, he's self-governed, my parenting style. No one's going to be around. What are you going to do? So he demonstrated that type of character. So I was comfortable middle school and high school. If he needed to be by himself, well, it wasn't often in middle school, but definitely in high school, then it was no problem. But I am biased because had he been a girl, that wouldn't have been the case, going to be honest.
How is your parenting style a reaction to the way you were parented?
Oh, wow.
Didn't have kids.
I
was a why child. So if you don't tell me why, I'm doing it. That's just how hard-headed, whatever you want. If you tell me just because you said so, because I said so. My mom's Jamaican, so it's, you can imagine the battle there. But if you didn't give me a why and make it make sense, listen, run it. I'm on it. So I made sure with my son, I was an explainer. Let me tell you why you shouldn't do this or why you should do this, what the outcomes will be. And it was a much more pleasant experience than how I grew up.
Did your parents always get into the why, or was it more like just do this?
Do it.
Anybody else?
No whys.
No.
Dustin?
No whys.
I have to say, I rather enjoyed actually my childhood being free range, leaving the house, disappearing. They claim to have known where I was all that time, but I don't remember what they were doing. So I kind of enjoyed that. And now when I look back and we tell these stories among friends, like stuff 6, 7 years old, they're kind of shocked that, wait, where were you? And we were 6 years old.
Yeah, for me, and I have kids too, but it dawned on me a few years ago. I had this memory of, we had this little swimming pond in the subdivision that I grew up in. And the kids in the neighborhood used to go there to swim, never adults around. And I would go down there with my best friend in the neighborhood, and we would have our little brothers and sisters with us too. And it hit me, oh my gosh, we were 8 and we were responsible for the 3-year-olds? Are you kidding me? Swimming by ourselves with no one, it's amazing that they can drown. So definitely different.
This is fascinating because when in the conversation with mostly those born in the 60s, I really didn't identify with a lot of those stories. I feel like I have a leg definitely in the universe that you guys grew up in. What is your relationship with the GI generation and your grandparents? That's where I'm going with this.
Okay.
They were the only people who showed love.
What?
They were the only people who showed love, were the grandparents. It's
Okay.
kind of like it skipped a generation or something.
They were definitely rocks for me. When my growing up, they were always stable. We saw them every summer, every Christmas, from New York to Ohio. And then when the divorce happened, my mom's parents stayed with us for sometimes weeks at a time to help keep things stable. So the GI generation to me were like, and both my grandfathers were World War II vets, and all these stories. So it was like demigods walking the planet. I kind of saw GIs.
I'm wondering how we break down that generation, because usually the grandchild relationship, usually like Melody talked about love, that's usually what it is. It's usually they're not coming with the discipline. That's the parents. They're not coming with certain things. Usually what the grandparents usually have for you is the love. So how do we measure it when we're like the grandchildren having that relationship with them, as opposed to if we weren't, it would be different? I'm not sure how we measure that.
In my situation, it's very similar to the others who've spoken. After my parents got divorced, moved back to my mother's hometown. I lived a block and a half away from my grandparents, saw them every day. They raised me along with my mother. I have the same feelings towards them that Sean spoke of. They were, and others spoke of. They were the adults in the room. And I think that, and it's interesting to me that a lot of Gen Xers have that experience where the grandparents, they were raised with the grandparents. They are either in the house or right by the the house right close, and have it's almost like it was a grandchild relationship, but there's also a parent-child relationship component too, because they were the ones raising you. So I think of my grandfather. He was my grandfather, but he really was the father figure in my life. So I think there's kind of a little bit of a,
We're going to get to Reagan later, but in Reagan's politics, definitely, he doesn't reflect my politics, but I do think it's interesting that in the 80s, Reagan was a member of the GI generation, and it felt like America had a grandparent in charge. And it's just, that thought just came in my head. And that's the difference. I felt like our country was being raised by grandparent.
It's so funny, Ryan. I remember, I didn't even realize it until you said that. And it reminded me of conversations sophomore year in high school, where just sort of spontaneously we were gabbing and we all said, oh my gosh, doesn't he remind you of your grandpa?
Right.
We kind of said the same thing, and I absolutely forgot about that until you mentioned something.
And Mr. Rogers. It's just.
I don't want to throw my parents under the bus. You know, my parents, my mom was very, very young when she had me. She was 19. And I know who my biological father is, but I've never met him. So when she married, I mentioned this in the other video, when she married when I was 2.5, that man adopted me. So when I refer to my parents, that's who I'm talking about is my adoptive father, but he's my dad. You know, he's the one who raised me. They were very, very present. They were almost too present. And that definitely made me an anomaly in my neighborhood because they were core boomers. And they were there with their very their very core boomer style of parenting, which was wildly different from the war baby parents and the silents who were raising my peers.
Did everyone here have boomer parents?
I had war baby boomers.
Okay.
So 1944.
Okay.
1947 for me.
Are they like what we refer to now as like helicopter parents, kind of like, were they pioneers of that, or?
Were they pioneers? No, and it's interesting. I can even see my sister is 10 years younger than I am, so she's a Wire. She's 1980. That would still be considered Xer, I think. She was raised much more differently. She had different boomer parents than I had. I had boomer parents who were heavily persuaded by what we call the awakening. You know, and the awakening values. Also, my mom was 19. My dad was 21. That just changes the way that they interact. When I say they were very present, it was more that they had there were no taboo topics, is how I phrased it. So it could be a little bit rattling that anything they felt I needed to hear, whether I was 4 or 8 or 14, it was all out there. And that could be a little bit uncomfortable, where it was like, oh, please, can we not talk about this right now? But, you know, they were going to do that. And so I still feel very much like, even though I had boomer parents, I still feel very much like I was a child of the awakening because I was introduced to all of these things that kids were introduced to. It's just that I was introduced to it through conversation, not necessarily through experience.
Wow.
Yeah, it's funny because when I think about my parents, they were on the other end of the cusp. They were 40 and 44, and my mom at least quite religious, and so they were very much trying to be, you know, countercultural, pushing us in a conservative direction. But what strikes me about it is how kind of pervasive the culture is. Almost no matter what your parents want to do. Because it was the 70s after all, so we were messing around in sewer pipes or in storm sewer pipes.
Yes, we were.
And
that's the kind of stuff I was talking about before.
Right. I don't know.
Specifically sewer pipes, yes.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, it actually was. Yeah.
A bunch of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Yeah, it was. You know, you'd stand there in the creek and there's the pipe, and you're kind of like, how far do you go in?
Exactly.
I did that too.
Yep.
Did we bring flashlights?
No flashlights.
And you know, what's funny, and I don't know if it's because the world changed or if I got older and started pushing back, but by the time I was a teenager, they started, you know, trying to have more influence, but there was just some family stuff going on that, you know, I have a brother with special needs, and so you know, mom had to go to work, and you know, there's 3 brothers and sisters that I got to take care of. So you went from this kind of idyllic screwing around, playing with BB guns, you know, 0 to 10, 0 to 12, to, as I think I said on the chat, you know, we had child abductors and molestations and rumors of church clergy abuse going on around town. And then my folks responding to that by doing this, you know, when I'm 14. And much like Maarifa, if you say because I said so, that's no reason whatsoever. And so, I don't know, it's a different thing. But, you know, there was no divorce. They were religious. They tried their best to be decent parents. And somehow or other, I still ended up, you know, core X.
So my cohorts love to talk about television shows in the 80s and the 90s. And I feel like we just like hog that conversation, you know, ooh, Ninja Turtles, this and that, 90s kid, this and that. But really, I think Gen X started the trend. The image I have is of the Gen X in front of the television every Saturday every Saturday morning with a big cereal bowl.
Yep.
What were some of y'all favorite shows?
Schoolhouse Rock, and the thing that was the most important person in the whole wide world is you, and you hardly even know you, whatever that thing was. Bugs Bunny, Roadrunner Hour, things like that.
Land of the Lost.
Looney Tunes.
Loves babies.
Hey.
Albert. Television.
We used to watch the Dukes of Hazzard.
Oh yeah.
Happy Days.
My mom didn't allow Dukes of Hazzard.
Yeah, I used to, you know, it's funny though. I used to watch like Happy Days and Three's Company as a little kid, and Laverne and Shirley. And now when I see these shows, I'm like, how was it even entertaining for me? No idea what was going on, you know.
What about the Brady Bunch? We kind of have that going on here.
I love the Brady Bunch. Yeah.
Right, it is true.
More Partridge Family.
Right.
Yep.
My
You,
favorite
Brady
Well,
Bunch.
to go back to that point I was making, you know, I don't know if I consciously thought it, but I very much took my cues, especially if my family's, you know, crazy and religious and isn't giving me honest answers to things. TV's where you see what's going on. So, you know, I remember very clearly thinking the Brady Bunch, if that's what's supposed to be going on and this is what's going on in my family, that there's something not right here.
That's exactly what my aunt says, and she was born, I think, in like the late 60s, and she was a teenager. She was about 13 to 15 when Brady Bunch was on, and her family was so wildly different from Brady Bunch that she got obsessed with the show. She looked exactly like Marsha Brady, and like she was like, that's what it's supposed to be like, and it made her bitter toward her family because they weren't like that. And that's kind of how I felt in the 80s watching things, you know, like Cosby Show. And I'm like, my family's not like that. Something's wrong with my family, you know?
I'm the oldest of 7 to a single mom. And I distinctly remember her saying after every Thursday night, we are not the Cosby. I said, oh, okay. But I already knew that. She gave me her perspective. Me as the oldest of 7 with a survivalist mom already knew that our family wasn't like that. So to the point of saying, because I said so, I got that. And I didn't ask him any more questions. Even though I was very inquisitive, Diane Swain wasn't the one to ask. Not at that time, because if she told you then, that means she has no time to explain. You better get it.
How did you guys feel about Roseanne? Because that was, you know,
Loved
a
it.
show that was supposed to be, you know.
Didn't watch it.
It was made by the producers of the Cosby Show too.
Yeah.
Warner.
Yeah, because that was supposed to be, you know, the stepping away from the perfect family and the beautiful clean house, and supposed to be more realistic. But you don't think that it was actually?
I thought it was
funny how
wonderful.
Roseanne isn't popular, but I bet you Married with Children.
Mary, I was about to mention
everybody
that.
watched
Yes.
that, and I feel like that's in the same type of.
And The Simpsons.
Yeah, and The Simpsons, like they're opposite Brady Bunch, and opposite Cosby Show.
I feel like Fox was Gen X, or all the early Fox shows.
Fox was the answer to NBC and CBS and all that. It was the antithesis of it. That's what made it so great when it first started.
It was confusing because what I remember when I was like very small, Fox was like some kind of BS channel that was showing like old war movies and things like that. Everything changed.
I remember the movie that was made of the Brady Bunch in '95.
Yeah, I love it.
The contrast was hysterical.
The humor.
Yeah. Kind of showing the difference between what would, you know, it was already, Brady Bunch was already kind of outlandish for the early 70s. Just put it into the 90s and it was just pure caricature.
Yeah.
So what shows did you guys?
I feel like in the 90s, we were combating the 70s.
Yeah.
You know? It's like, just as like 90s kids thought the 80s were just awful, it's like we as 80s kids, we thought the 70s were just awful.
Right.
You know, you always think the generation before is like, you're trying to break away from it.
That's funny you say that because I didn't really like the 80s until the 2000s. That's when all of a sudden they had 80s parties. And I'm like, oh, we like the 80s now?
Oh, I loved the 80s at the time. Loved it.
Yeah. Me too.
Okay.
I didn't appreciate the 80s for what they were.
So in the 80s, we had MTV. Did you feel like did you identify with the image that was on MTV?
MTV. Wow, this is a tough one. This is tough. I wasn't big into sitting there watching music videos. Like I'm just gonna watch one over and over and over. But I could relate to the rebellious side of the music they were talking about. And this is all versions. This is rock. This is hip hop. This is like MTV was like well, for me, it was like the anti-societal type setup. So I can relate to MTV from that standpoint. But as far as watching it over and over until they moved into more of a show type standpoint, just watching the videos over and over. But the news, who were the guys that were popping on the MTV news?
Kurt
Loder.
And how old is he, Melody? How old is he, Melody?
75.
Right. Right.
Do you guys remember Jon Stewart being on it?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I did.
Oh, wow. I don't.
You remember the game show Remote Control?
I do.
Yes. Yeah.
I love that.
I do remember Martha Quinn.
Yes.
Yes.
Julie Brown.
Julie Brown.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember coming home at 5 and 6 years old with my brother. We were so little, but the first thing we would do is turn on MTV because that was when there was only a handful of videos. They were all timed. They all played at the same time of the day. ZZ Top, Dire Straits, Always Afraid, Michael Jackson Thriller, like Getting Under the Bed. I'm still afraid to this day. I'm almost 40 because of that image I had. But we were addicted to MTV then. I don't even know.
Well, and there was even still, you think back and you see memes about this where it's like, you remember playing your radio and like diving across the bed when that song finally comes on the radio, hit a record.
Yes.
Same thing with MTV. You'd have the VHS on and you'd wait for that video so that you can wait for it because you wanted that song on tape and you'd quickly hit record.
I did that.
And I think my parents actually still have like the 2 or 3 VHS they allowed me to have to.
You only have 2 or 3? I have a whole box of them. Still do.
Room for them.
Gen X, we weren't given more than 2 or 3. Your allotment.
What video did y'all like? I don't want to use to rank them, but like what videos really stood out to you back then?
Take on Me.
Oh yes. Still one of my favorites.
You know what I loved was
Black Hole Sun for me.
Herbie Hancock.
Thriller.
Yes.
Definitely Thriller.
Okay. For some reason, Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer video.
Yes.
Maybe they played it too many times.
They did.
So good.
And what was the one with the women in the background? Oh, goodness sakes, they just went.
Robert Plant. Robert Palmer.
Yeah, that's it.
Palmer.
I remember that. See,
Don't Come Around Here No More by.
Oh yeah, Tom Petty.
Where they're cutting up the cake.
Oh yeah.
ZZ Top Legs.
Yes.
Played that all the time.
Every day.
So in the last group, I mentioned Parents Don't Understand by Will Smith, and it was like crickets. Like, you remember that, Sherry and Amy? No one remembered.
I still don't know what you're talking about.
Parents Just Don't Understand by Will Smith. So that just made me realize, okay, so did the first wave identify more with like music in the 80s, and the second wave was more about the 90s? Like Kurt Cobain. Like, do you guys identify with Kurt Cobain, or is that more like the Y, Gen Y? Is that more my generation?
Oh, whoa. Kurt Cobain is ours.
Okay.
Yeah,
he's ours. Yeah.
All right.
Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Soundgarden, you mentioned, all of that, that's us. Public Enemy, that's us.
Now, I'm Atari Wave, and basically, grunge was something at the time that was not something I liked. I like it now in retrospect. And, the early hip-hop and grunge from that era. But my musical taste stopped with Smashing Pumpkins. And I actually still to this day still get Smashing Pumpkins and early Green Day confused.
Smashing Pumpkins and Green Day get confused?
I would think
early Green Day.
Oh, really? Okay. Wow.
I think it depends on when you hit teenagerism. You know what I mean? Like, if you were a teenager in the 80s, then you're more probably toward 80s music. If you teenage
I'm class of 86, so that says a lot, I guess.
Well, and I don't want to throw out just because I was 13 in 80 whatever, 84 maybe, doesn't mean I want to throw out when I was 23 either. So all of that 1984, 85 music was important, but it was important in one way. That doesn't mean that Cobain is not ours as well.
Right.
Did his dad?
Go for it.
Yeah,
The Jackson 5, are they yours or the adult Michael Jackson? Which one? Or both?
Adult.
The very young adult Michael Jackson.
See, now I'm thinking I'm 1960s. I'm suddenly like feeling not an Xer here.
This is our dilemma, Amy.
Well,
like we keep jumping in and out. That's
when Jackson 5 songs come on, though, I think of my young childhood and get very excited.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And see, when I hear Jackson 5, I'm thinking that's right before me.
Yeah.
That's right before I came on the scene.
I think of my
parents. I'm 78, so it's
yeah.
Well, and we had radio back then. Radio was real big for us because we only had 4 channels on TV, and the rest of it was all radio. So like on the radio, there were more channels that played 70s and 60s music than there were that played 80s music.
We were
back in the early 80s, the 70s just bled right into the early 80s.
What was on your mixtape, Melody?
Huh?
What was on your mixtape?
Here we go.
It was definitely Aha, like early Guns N' Roses, very much. At one point, Faith No More came in there. I got harder as we got closer to the 90s. So once 9 Inch Nails came out, I was done. I was like, oh, that's the one for me, man.
Who else had a mixtape?
That's my soul.
I was really.
So did you guys? You said you didn't watch MTV. It wasn't really as big of a deal as you feel like society links Gen X to, because they call it the MTV generation. So did you? Because I know for me, my childhood, we would spend whole afternoons just sitting on the front porch with our transistor radio listening to music. Was that part of your childhood experience or no?
My young childhood, it was the car radio because my parents always had the radio on. And so especially summer songs when we were driving to vacation, a summer song from 76, 77, 78, 79, they're all drilled into my head.
And what are some of those summer songs from your childhood?
Oh, one would be Jerry Rafferty's Baker Street.
I love that song.
Things like that.
Anything by Journey, for better or for worse.
Yay! Well, 80s saxophone is the best. There's no instrument or era that an instrument is featured better than 80s saxophone, and Rafferty's Baker Street is totally exemplary of that. We could go on for days just on that subject if y'all let me. I'm kind of a music.
So Brandy, not a summer song for you.
Brandy?
Yeah.
I think it's one of those songs.
She's a fine girl.
Yeah.
Oh!
That was something I discovered later because in the early 70s I was pretty little. So, I remember the Carpenters and John Denver and all the 8-track tapes my parents had.
Well, when the Big Chill soundtrack came on, or that came out, that was my parents. They just listened to it over and over and over again. Big Chill was huge for our parents.
What did you think of it? What was your guys' interpretation of the Big Chill? How do you view it?
Love it. So many good memories.
That's funny because the boomers hate it. They went after that movie.
I was sort of wondered what happened to them, and I guess they tried to explain it, but I still don't. I was writing there. I never really understood their
they were very self-absorbed. Outside, that seemed pretty, boomerish to me. So I took face value.
Yeah.
That's one thing I was going to say about our grandparents is I think they were the last generation that wasn't self-absorbed.
Mm-hmm.
They were not self-absorbed at all.
Right.
It's they were almost pushing everything off themselves rather than pulling everything in.
I don't feel like our parents had to schedule times with them too. They were always willing to watch us. You mentioned Brandy as a summer song, so I'm on the other side of that. Was LFO Summertime Girl? Is that a summer song for you guys? I feel like it was for me.
Not ringing a bell.
What that is?
Sing it.
Okay. Icons. So let's go to Cobain. Biggie, Tupac. I mean, how did those deaths influence you? Did it move you guys when they died?
Oh yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Tupac was big. Biggie was expected, but Tupac Wow, this is how much time we have for this one. This is
Go for it.
I mean, Tupac represented a lot of speaking to injustice. It represented we're going to rebel against it. We don't care how it looks. You're not going to take our culture, our subculture, I'll say, and make us out to be thugs when there's other things that contradict that. It's almost like the pot calling the kettle black. You know, America has plenty of sins, plenty of dirt that it does to people, and we're not going to be labeled as, you know, the people who, you know, the sinners of the generation. Mm-hmm. So when Tupac stood up and he was, you know, proclaiming his message, in his music and his voice, it was huge. And then for him to be killed, right. That impacted hip hop in the Black generation. I'll say also, mm-hmm. it was huge. I mean, it was like our first generational martyr mm-hmm. that we had. And even though we're not saying Tupac was perfect, no one recognized Tupac as a classy, role model individual. No one was confused with that. But we're just talking about what he represented, what he stood for, mm-hmm. being your authentic self, speaking to injustice, and different things like that. So the Tupac, as an introductory topic, Ryan, mm-hmm. The impact was huge. Biggie, not so much in that regard, but Tupac was mm-hmm. huge.
Tupac's huge to my 18-year-old. Like an idol, an icon to my Millie, really? Zoomer, whatever you want to call him, son. Mm-hmm. Huge impact on that, he and his friends.
Tupac was in Juice. Yes, like his acting style, his mm-hmm. acting was great. Mm-hmm. And he went to an art school. I went to an art high school, so I do feel like I know Tupac's story.
We were used to musicians killing themselves, committing suicide, right. waking up in their own vomit. Yeah, we weren't used to musicians being killed. Mm-hmm. And I think that was one of the first times that we were just like, they're not invulnerable,
Mm-hmm. Right. And Ryan, to your point, he did so much. Like I feel like I think Tupac died when he was 25.
Yeah.
And his body of work, from acting to the music, I mean, he did so much in that small window of time. That always impressed me.
Mm-hmm. John Hughes. Let's go to the 80s. Mm-hmm. Did he depict the Xer experience?
The early one.
Sort of. Yeah. For me, it did. It was a little very caricatured. So it lost some accuracy in that respect. But generally speaking, he hit it dead on. Mm-hmm. Especially in upper class. Now, I didn't live in those really nice neighborhoods that his movies generally were in. But yeah, I think he did a pretty good job.
I think John Hughes was really good at creating characters. Yeah, I think some of the characters he created, they were pretty spot on. The stories themselves were, they were a little kitschy. They were a little silly. Mm-hmm. I don't know anybody who was living those kinds of lives, but the actual characters, I thought he did a pretty good job with that.
Yeah.
So is there a movie or a TV show that you watched and you thought, that's my story, that's me, finally, I see myself?
Not until the 90s.
What was the one with Alex P. Keaton? What was that show?
Family Ties.
My parents were McGovernite liberals and kind of atheists, and I rebelled. Please don't hold this against me, but I rebelled and became a conservative Republican. National Review, Human Events. I even started reading some John Birch Society material until I realized who they were. And I would leave John Birch Society material on the coffee table just to disturb my parents. For the Reagan Bush campaign before I was old enough to vote. I'm now kind of come back home to FDR liberalism. But at the time I was I didn't wear a tie and stuff, but I was kind of the Alex P. Keaton of my family.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Sean, you're helping me out because I wanted to transition to the Reagan era. But before we move there, any last comments on movie?
I wanted to mention Gordon Gekko and the famous "Greed is Good" speech.
Okay.
Even as an 8-year-old, I was reciting in school, and I used to fill out little fake American Express card applications because I was dreaming of some sort of bright, wealthy future where I'd have my own yacht and sports cars. And things like that. It would wealth was so worshipped. My brother had this poster in his, next to the poster of Spuds MacKenzie or whatever, there was a poster of, this huge house with all these, Ferraris lined up in front of it on the beach. And that's sort of like what you wanted to have. Yeah. That's what life was supposedly about at that time. So I guess, Wall Street was definitely a big one, and I think that still resonates with people, or it sort of like haunts them a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think
It's good.
On the movie end, and that unfortunately we have to kind of get into this era because my background, because you asked if we could relate to any of this.
Yeah.
I really didn't relate to any of the John Hughes movies. I looked at the list. He's done a lot, and I apologize for not knowing exactly who John Hughes was. Looking at that list, it's pretty impressive. I would say out of his movies, I'm not sure if he did Dutch or not, but I thought Dutch was hilarious. Y'all remember Dutch? Dutch was when the guy from Married with Children. Yeah, so there's a divorce, and there's the second parent coming in, and the child's not feeling it. I thought that was a good movie, but the reemergence of blaxploitation movies in the 80s, New Jack City and Boys in the Hood in the 90s, and all these to portray, it kind of, I think you mentioned caricature, like, so here we are with that stereotype that really impacted my generation, my neighborhood, Black folks, how we're depicted in media. For the negative.
That was real. I mean, that was reflecting reality.
Right, but it was the context
freaking, scary too. And when you talk about
I wasn't aware of
terrifying.
I wasn't aware of what was going on until I mean it was kind of abstractly understood, but Boys in the Hood really had a big impact on me.
I was just gonna say, there is some reason to it. Like Justin was talking about, the realness and kind of bringing the message out to the masses, like Sean's talking about. At the same time, the context, it didn't like shine a light to where this is a problem. There are economic, political factors that are creating this environment. I don't know if y'all saw the documentary Blackfish. I think that's an excellent documentary people should watch about the killer whales. And when you take them out of their natural environment and put them in an environment where they're secluded or kind of oppressed for entertainment, these kind of things, they started to act out, attack each other. The fin that was strong in the natural environment now becomes bent over, and they're just kind of a docile creature struggling. And that's kind of like our relationship with America, where we were put in certain environments and certain parameters took over, and it kind of, the movies were supposed to like shine a light, like, look what's happening. We got to do something. Instead, it became like our identity. Like, this is who Black people are.
Gotcha.
This is who the Black man is. And so, boom. And so it didn't, and to me, it was a replay of what the 70s were with the blaxploitation movies. Right. It kind of brought in that type of attitude towards us, and we didn't get a chance. I really thought we missed an opportunity there, the adults at that time, to solve some problems that these movies were shining a light on.
I think The Wire is the only one that, The Wire, which is a show from the 2000s, is the only one that really reflects the time period, makes a statement on the time period. And really doesn't say, hey, look at this, we're cool. It's more like, we don't want to be this.
Right.
What do you think of this? Yeah, that's a good point. I think The Wire actually makes a good statement on the 80s and the 90s.
Right. Do you think The Wire is one of the greatest shows of all time?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Definitely. Thank you very much for watching the video. And we have another one coming up showing how Generation X raged against the machine. So make sure you don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell.